On a quiet night near Raven Point, a man checked in, then vanished. No footprints, no struggle, no explanation. This is a story of the disappearances that shook an entire town. On a silent February evening in 1998, 27-year-old wildlife surveyor Evan Reed eased his truck to a stop near mile 46, a stretch of road surrounded by nothing but snowfields and dense, unbroken forest. Raven Point was still 20 minutes away, but Evan knew this land better than anyone. Every ridge, every migration line, every silence. At 7:14 p.m., he radioed in his routine check-in to the regional station, his voice steady, unhurried. Then, without warning, the line cut. No interruption, no static, just absence. By the time the dispatcher tried to reach him again, the temperature had dropped to 20 below. Calls repeated. No answer. A patrol unit was sent out, tracing the long, frozen road until the beam of their headlights found Evan's truck sitting on the shoulder, idling quietly, exhaust drifting into the black air like breath from an unseen animal. The driver's door stood wide open, pushed against the wind. Inside, the engine hummed, the radio crackled faintly, and Evan's clipboard sat on the passenger seat as if it stepped out only for a moment. But outside, nothing made sense. The snow around the truck was untouched, smooth as glass. No footprints leading away. No sign of a struggle. No indication that Evan had walked, ran, or been dragged. It was as though he had opened his door, stepped into dark, and evaporated into the cold. The first responders circled the area with flashlights, their beams cutting through drifting snowflakes that looked almost suspended in the stillness. Dogs were brought in, their noses pressed into the icy wind, but they whined confused, unable to pick up a direction. Helicopters combed the line of treetops the next morning, blades sending ripples across the dead white fields. Nothing moved, nothing answered back. By the end of the second day, investigators began to grasp the unsettling truth. There was no logical place for Evan Reed to have gone. No trail, no predators in the area that night. No weather event that could swallow a person whole. It became the kind of disappearance Alaska feared most. Quiet, precise, without a single thread to pull. And as the search widened past mile 46, investigators found something else. A detail that would unsettle even the most seasoned among them. But that came later. For now, all there was an empty truck, an open door, and a man who had vanished without a sound. The search for Evan Reed began before sunrise, when the February skies still held the heavy blue of an unbroken night. By then, word already traveled through Raven Point. A truck left running at mile 46, a door ajar, and no sign of the man who had last spoken calmly over the radio only hours before. In towns like this, disappearances did not come quietly. They echoed through kitchens, across diner counters, and into tightening fear of people who understood how quickly the wilderness could swallow a life. State troopers established a command post near the roadside, their equipment tents snapping in the wind as the cold pressed in from all directions. Volunteers arrived in layers of worn winter gear, faces red from the early frost. Among them were locals who had known Evan since he was a boy, rugged men who had hunted the valleys with him, women who remembered him bringing rescued owls to the school children, search teams who trusted his instincts more than any map. And yet, for the first time, those instincts offered no direction to follow. They began with the obvious, a grid search expanding outward from the truck. Dozens moved in careful formation, stepping across the pristine snowfields that should have held at least one mark of Evan's passing. But the surface remained smooth, undisturbed, as if the landscape had sealed itself moments after he disappeared. Officers scanned the roadside ditch, probed the softer patches with poles, checked the tree-line for broken branches or drag trails. Nothing. As mid-morning sunlight strained through clouds, a team of dog handlers tried once more to pick up a scent. One shepherd circled the truck repeatedly before stopping, ears flat, letting out a low, uncertain growl. The handler later reported the reaction as something he'd only seen when dogs sensed a presence they couldn't place. Neither human nor animal, but something in between, something that unsettled them. By late afternoon, frustration settled over the searchers like a second layer of cold. Radios crackled with updates that all sounded the same. No sign, no tracks, no evidence of direction or struggle. It was as though Evan had stepped out of the truck and dissolved into the air. But just as daylight began to fade, an officer radioed in from half a mile north of the site. He had found something small, half buried in the snow, something that did not belong there. And for the first time, the search shifted from confusion to unease. The small object found half a mile north of Evan's truck, a single orange survey flag, the kind you use to mark wildlife paths, should have been a breakthrough. Instead, it deepened confusion. The flag lay perfectly upright in the snow, untouched by wind, its plastic stem anchored in frozen ground. There were no footprints around it, no tracks leading toward or away from the spot. Investigators documented it, photographed it, bagged it, and then stood in a silent ring around the discovery, each person quietly asking the same question. How had it gotten there? Over the next 10 days, the search widened into canyons, riverbeds, and old trappers' trails. Helicopters scanned frozen lakes for fractures, and drones followed tree lines that seemed to repeat endlessly. Volunteers from neighboring towns joined, trudging through waist-deep drifts until exhaustion blurred their sense of distance. But every sweep ended the same way. Clean snow, untouched forest, no trace of Evan Reed. By the third week, the bitter Alaskan winter tightened its grip. Storms rolled in from the coast, burying previously searched areas beneath fresh snow that erased all hope of new evidence. One by one, the volunteers drifted back to their jobs, their families, their routines. The command tents were taken down. The troopers' vehicles grew fewer. And in the quiet that followed, the town of Raven Point carried a heavy, unspoken truth. If the wilderness didn't want to give someone back, it wouldn't. Detectives built a case file thick with interviews, weather logs, terrain maps, and radio transcripts. Evan's background was combed through. No debts, no disputes, no signs of wanting to disappear. His final radio message, replayed over and over, offered nothing unusual. No tremor in his voice. No hint of fear. Just a man finishing his day's work. Without witnesses, without leads, and without a body, the investigation stalled. After 6 silent months, the official status shifted from active search to pending review, a bureaucratic phrase that meant what everyone already knew. The case had gone cold. But even as the file was boxed and stored on a high shelf in the Anchorage evidence vault, a handful of detectives remained unsettled by its emptiness. Cases grew dusty for many reasons. Lack of evidence, fading memories, a slow way to time. But this one felt different. It felt incomplete. And years later, it would be that incompleteness that pulled the file back into the light, forcing the department to ask a question they had avoided since the very first night. Whether they had been looking in the wrong direction all along. 21 years had passed since Evan Reed vanished from mile 46. The snowfields that had swallowed him remained unchanged, silent witnesses to a town's long, quiet suffering. Raven Point had endured, its population steady, its streets narrow and familiar. Yet beneath that veneer of normalcy lingered stories of absence. Families had moved on outwardly, but memories of missing friends and loved ones clung stubbornly to the walls of empty houses and abandoned cabins. The case file, dusty and forgotten in the Anchorage evidence vault, was nearly invisible to a world that had already moved forward. That changed the day Detective Mara Ellingson arrived, newly transferred from Fairbanks. She was drawn to Raven Point not by duty alone, but by the inexplicable pull of cases that refused closure. Her first week was spent reviewing decades of paperwork, carefully cataloging every detail overlooked or dismissed. At first glance, the files were ordinary. Police logs, interview transcripts, maps, and photographs. But something nagged at her, a misfiled box labeled only miscellaneous evidence, read Evan. It had been misplaced for years, ignored, nearly erased from memory. Inside, she discovered a small, mud-stained handheld cassette recorder. Its surface cracked but intact, its tape still wound tight. A label, faded and handwritten, read, property of E. Reed. Nothing in the original case report mentioned it. How it came to rest here, hidden for over 2 decades, was a mystery that immediately set her mind racing. She held the recorder with care, aware that it might hold nothing at all, or it might hold everything. Objects from the past carry weight in ways that people do not, she thought. They are fragments of a life interrupted, shards of a moment frozen. In the quiet of the evidence room, the recorder seemed to hum faintly in her hand, as if it remembered something she could not yet hear. Ellingson knew instinctively that this was a thread to pull, the reason the case had refused to die in the eyes of the living. And as she prepared to examine it further, she realized that reopening the investigation would not just be about facts and files. It would demand confronting decades of uncertainty, fear, and grief. Somewhere beyond the frostbitten edges of Mile 46, Evan Reed's story was waiting to be heard again. And with this small recorder in her hands, Detective Ellingson was about to listen. The first clue in decades had resurfaced, and with it, the cold, unanswered questions began to stir once more. Detective Mara Ellingson placed a mud-stained cassette recorder carefully on the evidence table, her gloved hands brushing lightly over its worn edges. The device was simple, unassuming, yet the air around it seemed charged, as if decades of silence had concentrated into a single, fragile object. She examined the tape, noting the faint indentations of its winding wheels, the subtle pressure marks where someone's fingers had pressed too hard, too softly. Traces of a life once present. This was no ordinary evidence. It was a bridge across time, a chance to hear Evan Reed's voice again after more than 2 decades of questions and absence. The detective called an audio specialist from Anchorage. The team transferred the tape into a high-fidelity player, amplifying the low, static-laden signal until it was possible to discern shapes within the noise. For a long moment, the room held nothing but the hiss of the old magnetic tape. Then, almost imperceptibly, Evan's voice broke through, faint but steady, describing the last moments before he disappeared. He spoke of the snowfield stretching endlessly, of a low hum in the air, of lights moving above the treetops. Things no one else could have seen. He did not sound afraid. Instead, he sounded focused, precise, recording observations for his work. Yet beneath the calm, a tension lingered, a subtle unease that only time could reveal as foreshadowing. As the specialist enhanced the tape further, a detail emerged that had gone unnoticed in the original investigation. A second voice, whispering Evan's name. It was too soft to identify, too irregular to be humanly patterned, and it appeared only intermittently, overlapping with the drone he described. Every repetition of the name seemed to coincide with a pause, as if the world itself had shifted with his breathing. Detective Ellingson leaned closer, sensing that this small, overlooked fragment might be the key to everything, the point where reason, evidence, and something inexplicable intersected. She traced the anomalies in the audio against old search maps, noting that the moment this second voice appeared corresponded to a precise location in the forest near Mile 46. The same pattern repeated at 2 other disappearance sites from the late 1980s. It was a link no one had recognized before, buried in the margin of history, waiting for someone patient enough to notice. And as the tape wound down, the last is lingering in the room like a held breath, Ellingson realized that this evidence would force the investigation beyond what the town, or even the state, had ever imagined. The voice on the cassette was more than a clue. It was a warning, and it demanded the search continue, deeper, longer, and closer to the truth than anyone had dared before. Detective Mara Ellingson spent the following days piecing together the threads left behind by Evan Reed, following the faint echoes embedded in the cassette tape. She returned to Raven Point to speak with those who had lived through his disappearance, hoping that the decades had not completely buried memory. First, she met Evan's sister, Clara, who remembered the last time she had seen him, a casual wave as he drove toward Mile 46. Her eyes betrayed a mixture of grief and lingering unease. She admitted that, even years later, she sometimes imagined hearing his voice on the wind near the tree line. Next came a retired sheriff, Thomas Hanley, whose tenure had begun shortly before Evan vanished. Hanley's office smelled of old wood and paper, files stacked haphazardly, a faint dust settling in the corners. He spoke cautiously, recalling other disappearances from the 1980s and 1990s, each case similar in its quiet incomprehensibility. "People vanish out here," he said softly, almost as if confessing a secret. "Not always because of the snow, not always because of the cold. Sometimes it's the place itself." Ellingson also sought out a retired ranger, Gideon Parks, who had patrolled the forests and rivers where Evan had been conducting surveys. Parks described unusual patterns he had observed over the years. missing wildlife, disturbed campsites with no footprints, and sudden, inexplicable shifts in the weather. Each recollection carried the weight of authority, yet hinted at a realm beyond normal explanation. He spoke of seeing fleeting shapes near the road, of sensing a presence in the forest that vanished the moment he approached. "I never told anyone," he admitted. "People would have thought me mad." By compiling these recollections, Ellingson began mapping the incidents. She noted dates, times, and locations. Patterns emerged where none had been seen before. 3 decades of disappearances, connected not by motive or crime, but by geography and inexplicable phenomena. The forest itself, the roads, the isolated fields, they form an unbroken chain of unresolved vanishings. As the day waned, Ellingson stood near mile 46, the wind biting through her coat. The cassette's hum, the witnesses' voices, and the echoes of old reports coalesced into a single, unnerving realization. Evan Reed's disappearance was part of something far larger than a single man lost in the snow. And in that quiet, she understood the investigation would have to move beyond the visible evidence, into the anomalies buried in decades of silence, before the next clue could reveal itself. Detective Mara Ellingson returned to Anchorage to review the archive case files with fresh eyes, determined to uncover what had been hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and time. The folders were thick, yellow with age, marked with standard labels: interviews, search reports, weather logs. But as she sifted through the paperwork, a single section caught her attention. Pages that had been blacked out, redacted in dense black ink, obscuring critical notes, witness statements, and coordinates. Whoever had handled the original investigation had deliberately erased these details, leaving only the barest skeleton of a story. Ellingson traced each redaction carefully, noting patterns. Many refer to locations near mile 46, some to specific descriptions of the forest terrain, and a few to unusual observations made by search teams, odd tracks, unexpected sounds, and items found in impossible positions. One page contained the words "unverified phenomenon," yet the rest was obscured. A handwritten note in the margin, almost invisible beneath the black marker, read simply, "Do not disclose." The intent was clear. Someone had wanted the truth buried. As she continued, a former trooper, now retired, agreed to speak off the record. He described arriving at mile 46 hours after Evan's disappearance, only to find federal agents already on the scene. "They took control quickly, moved things around, told us to document only what they allowed," he admitted, his voice low, weighed with years of unease. "We were told it was a standard procedure. I know better." The revelation sent a chill through Ellingson. Evidence mishandled, instructions veiled in secrecy. The puzzle deepened. Finally, tucked beneath a stack of old maps, she found a photograph previously unseen. It showed the snow near Evan's truck, but in the image were faint, circular impressions, shallow and symmetrical, pressed into the frozen ground. They did not match human footprints, nor any known animal. The detail had never been recorded in the initial investigation. Ellingson stared at the photo, understanding that these subtle anomalies, buried for decades, might hold the key to the case. Every suppressed file, every redacted page, every obscured observation hinted at something far larger than a simple disappearance. And as she placed the photograph carefully back into the evidence folder, a single thought echoed in her mind. The trail was still there, waiting for someone patient enough to follow it. Somewhere, the next clue was poised to surface, and it would demand that the investigation move beyond ordinary explanations into the realm of the inexplicable. As Detective Mara Ellingson delved deeper into the redacted files, contradictions began to emerge, unsettling in their subtlety, yet impossible to ignore. Official reports claimed Evan Reed had been last seen checking his radio at exactly 7:14 p.m., but a series of overlooked radio logs suggested a brief transmission just 3 minutes later. A fragment of voice, distorted and incomplete, mentioning a light moving above the trees. That discrepancy, buried in the margins of routine documentation, hinted at either error or deliberate omission. Even witness statements were inconsistent. Clara Reed had described Evan as meticulous and methodical, unlikely to stray from the safety of his truck in the freezing forest. Yet, multiple searchers recalled seeing footprints near mile 46 that seemed to appear and disappear, not following a logical path. as if someone had stepped lightly on the surface and then vanished. Other notes contradicted the official timeline of the helicopter sweep, placing reconnaissance teams in locations that were later erased from the case map. Ellingson realized the contradictions were not isolated. Several missing person reports from Raven Point referenced small, anomalous details that seemed almost trivial at the time. Tents left perfectly folded, vehicles found in impossible positions, witnesses recalling sounds or glimpses of lights that others had not noticed. In isolation, each anomaly could be dismissed. Together, they formed a pattern that defied simple explanation. Complicating matters further were the statements from retired officials, who admitted they had been instructed to downplay unusual observations. "We were told to stick to what could be confirmed," one former officer confessed. Anything outside that, it didn't exist. The files, Ellingson understood, had been sanitized, a story shaped to fit the narrative of natural disappearance and human error, leaving little room for the strange, inexplicable phenomena that seemed increasingly central to Evan's case. By the end of her review, a chilling realization settled in. The contradictions were not merely clerical errors or lapses in memory. They were windows into a reality that had been deliberately obscured. Patterns of disappearances, faint voices on a decades-old cassette, and the anomalies in the snow were all interconnected. Ellingson closed the folders and leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of decades pressing down. The evidence was fragmented, the records conflicting, and yet each inconsistency whispered the same truth. The case was far from over. The contradictions were not obstacles. They were a guide, pointing toward a revelation that would challenge every assumption the town, and even the state, had held for more than 20 years. And somewhere beyond the frozen tree line of mile 46, the answers waited hidden in the silence. Detective Mara Ellingson returned to Raven Point with the redacted files, the cassette, and the photograph of the strange impressions near mile 46. She needed to see the land itself, to walk the frozen forests and snowfields that had swallowed Evan Reed and countless others. Maps could only reveal so much. The wilderness held its own truths. One could sense if patient enough to notice the subtleties. She began by overlaying decades of disappearance sites onto topographical charts. At first, the incident seemed random, isolated vanishings scattered across the expanse of forest surrounding the town. But when she plotted them precisely, a disturbing pattern emerged. The locations aligned along subtle geographic lines. Ridges, frozen streams, and open clearings that appeared mundane at first glance, but when viewed together, formed a network tracing the edges of mile 46 and stretching outward like veins through the wilderness. Ellingson visited each site in sequence, walking the cold, silent trails while snow crunched under her boots. She compared her observations to the statements of past searchers, noticing how anomalies consistently appeared along these lines. Footprints that began and ended without explanation, objects found upright in snow without any disturbance, faint hums on the wind reported only by those present at the moment. The land itself seemed to dictate the disappearance, controlling the paths taken, erasing evidence, and leaving only fragments for investigators to find. Even the forest topography seemed to contribute. Hollow depressions, subtle rises in terrain, and gaps in tree lines all corresponded with the locations of vanished individuals. The wilderness was not passive. It was a stage, a participant in a sequence that repeated over decades. Every element of the terrain appeared to be part of a calculated, almost deliberate alignment, each disappearance following a logic invisible to outsiders, yet unyielding in its consistency. By the end of the day, standing on a ridge that overlooked the familiar sweep of mile 46, Ellingson felt the weight of the pattern pressing down on her. This was no ordinary missing person case. The wilderness had a rhythm, a hidden order that had dictated the fates of those who had crossed its paths. And as she traced her fingers along the lines on the map, a chilling thought emerged. If the pattern could be mapped, then perhaps the next disappearance could be anticipated. Somewhere beyond the snow and trees, the next clue awaited, one that would test the limits of logic, perception, and the very nature of the wilderness itself. In the course of reviewing historical documents related to Raven Point, Detective Mara Ellingson stumbled across an overlooked archive labeled Station K, 21. It was a small, remote outpost once used for environmental monitoring, long abandoned and tucked deep into the northern forests. Among the dusty binders and weathered notebooks, one journal stood out, a leather-bound record, its edges frayed, the pages yellowed and brittle with age. The spine had been cracked, suggesting frequent use, and a faint scent of pine resin lingered between the pages. The journal contained daily entries from a field technician named Harold Grayson, who had been stationed at K-21 in the late 1990s. At first, the notes were innocuous: temperature readings, wildlife observations, and the routine maintenance of the outpost. But gradually, the entries shifted in tone. Grayson described noticing odd disturbances in the snow, circular impressions that appeared overnight, and lights moving above the tree line that had no discernible source. His words were careful, almost clinical, yet beneath the precision was a mounting unease. One entry in particular, dated February 17, 1998, just 3 days after Evan Reed's disappearance, made Ellingson pause. Grayson wrote of hearing voices carried on the wind, calling names familiar and unknown, and of footprints leading to areas of forest where no one could have walked. He noted a strong, unshakable feeling of being watched, as though the land itself was alive, observing and recording. Each line was imbued with fear, tempered by an effort to remain factual. Another passage referenced prior vanishings, cryptic references to others who came before, patterns in the disappearances that mirrored those he was witnessing firsthand. The meticulous detail suggested someone who was recording evidence for a reason beyond mere survival, someone aware that what was happening was systematic, deliberate, and repeatable. Ellingson felt a chill as she read the closing lines. "I fear the forest is not empty. It keeps them. It watches. And if we are not careful, it will watch us next." The journal transformed the investigation. It was no longer just a cold case of one missing man. It was a record of an unseen force, a pattern preserved in careful observation, a warning written decades before. As Ellingson carefully placed the journal into protective archival sleeves, she understood that the next step would require confronting both the wilderness and the history of those who had vanished, and that the answers, when found, would be far darker than anyone had imagined. Detective Mara Ellingson spent hours poring over the journal from Station K-21, cross-referencing Harold Grayson's observations with the documented disappearances near Raven Point. Slowly, patterns began to converge. The same circular impressions in snow, the same sudden silences in the forest, the inexplicable flickers of light above the treetops. The journal's details, once dismissed as paranoia or the embellishments of a solitary technician, now aligned uncannily with every anomaly recorded over more than 2 decades. Ellingson revisited the photographs of Evan Reed's final location, the impressions near mile 46, and the anomalies captured on the old cassette. Each element, when viewed individually, seemed inconsequential. Taken together, they painted a chilling portrait, a landscape capable of manipulating movement, erasing traces, and leaving only fragments of memory and evidence behind. She realized the forest was not passive. It had its own rhythm, its own rules, and anyone who entered unknowingly became part of its sequence. Interviews with former searchers and locals reinforced the same unsettling notion. One retired ranger recalled hearing disjointed voices in the tree line, whispers carrying names long missing, echoing through the stillness. Another described a feeling of displacement, as if the forest had shifted around him, closing paths he had just walked. Ellingson cataloged each account meticulously, aware that these were not coincidences but echoes of the same force Grayson had documented years before. The detective returned to mile 46, the heart of the disappearances. Standing in the quiet snow, she could sense the invisible pattern beneath her boots, the subtle undulations of ground and tree that had dictated the past events. She felt the echoes in the wind, faint, almost imperceptible, yet insistent, as if the forest itself were repeating the story of those who had vanished. Every detail she had gathered seemed to resonate with the same message. The truth was there, etched into the land, awaiting someone capable of understanding it. Ellingson knew the final step would demand more than maps, files, or photographs. It required confronting the wilderness directly, following the threads the forest had left, and tracing them back to their source. The echoes of the past were no longer whispers. They were a call to action, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow, she understood that the resolution of Evan Reed's disappearance, and perhaps of the countless others, was closer than ever, but the truth, when fully revealed, promised to challenge everything the town had believed about the forest, its silence, and what it truly held. Detective Mara Ellingson stood at the edge of the snow-covered ridge overlooking Mile 46, the wind biting through her coat, carrying with it the stillness that had haunted Raven Point for decades. The patterns, the redacted files, the whispers on cassette, and Grayson's journal all converged into reality, both tangible and unnerving. Yet, despite the weight of evidence, there remained a part of the story that refused to be spoken aloud, the pieces that could not be fully explained, the moments that belonged to the wilderness itself. Ellingson traced her gaze across the forest, noting the ridges and depressions that had dictated so many vanishings. Every snow-laden branch, every hollow, seemed to resonate with the echoes of those who had disappeared. The forest was a witness, a keeper of secrets that no human authority had ever fully controlled. The more she pieced together, the clearer it became that Raven Point was a place where reason faltered, where human logic met its limits, and where the missing left only traces of absence behind. The town had lived for decades with unanswered questions, with empty homes, with families suspended in grief. Now, the case files, the journal, and the anomalous evidence offered clarity, but it was clarity of a different kind, a truth less about resolution and more about recognition. Evan Reed, Florence Okbaluk, and the countless others had vanished into a space that defied conventional explanation, leaving only impressions on land and echoes in memory. Ellingson understood that some truths are not found in bodies or confessions, but in the silence that follows their absence. Returning to town, she met with Clara Reed one final time, sharing the patterns and observations she had uncovered. No answers could fully bring Evan back, yet acknowledging the evidence, the anomalies, and the scale of what had occurred provided a measure of closure, fragile but real. For the first time in decades, the family felt that the disappearance was no longer random or forgotten. It had a place in the history of the land and the consciousness of those who remained. As Ellingson filed the last of the update reports, she realized that Raven Point's story would always retain an element of the unspeakable. Some questions would remain unanswered, some voices unheard, and yet, in the acknowledgement of what had been lost, in the care taken to document, to remember, and to listen, there was a quiet triumph, a way to honor the missing while accepting that some mysteries belonged to the wilderness itself. The snow fell softly over Mile 46, covering the ridge and the forest below. And in that silence, the unspoken endured, a reminder that some truths, no matter how diligently pursued, are meant to linger beyond human reach. Thanks for watching.